Meet Reed Lance Rosenthal, rancher, #1 best-selling award-winning author, and unabashedly, unapologetically on the right side of the outstanding issues of our generation. But don't try to fence him in. Sometimes his positions will surprise you, because Reed is definitely his own man, with his own opinions. You might love him, you might hate him, but you won't be able to stop listening. Step over to the right side with Reed.
Howdy, listeners and viewers, coast to coast, the Gulf to the 51st state. I have to crack up every time I say that. And around the globe. This is Reed Lance Rosenthal on the Right Side Radio and the Cowboys Take on radio and podcasts and video outlets everywhere. And remember, if you think that the stuff here is needed, the information is needed by anybody you know, please pass on the link. Please hit subscribe. Hit the little bell, tells you when the next deal's coming out, and hit the like button too. That always helps. We're going to be starting some pretty cool conversations, some interviews here in the next 3 or 4 weeks, but we have some ground to cover before then. This is going to be the reality of money part 2. Hopefully I'll get it in 3 parts, maybe not. There's a lot to cover, and I'm trying to keep it really simple, because if you grasp the big picture, you don't really need the details. You just need to know what's going on with the dollar in your pocket. And it ain't good, folks. Hasn't been good for a long time, all the way back to really 1971 when Nixon took us off the gold standard. Been going downhill since then. So we're going to be talking about an element. You know, last week we talked about liquidity, money supply, the bond market. And I gave you the general, big picture of all those components, which is the equivalent of money, right? Currency, tangible assets, intangible assets, fiat currency. Listen to that show last week. It's a great, really general outline of the basic components of what we call money, which is really anything somebody will accept because they have faith and confidence in its value to give you value, whether it's food or a car or a house or whatever you want to discuss. That is money. And unfortunately, money is divided into 2 different types. Always has been, always will be, and it's really coming to fruition right now. There's fiat, which is basically paper, backed by nothing except the full faith and confidence of whatever government happens to be issuing the paper that day, or the governments who are issuing paper that day. And then there is real money. And real money are that's hard assets. It's metals, gold, silver, platinum, you know, the base metals, copper, zinc, nickel. I mean, real stuff. It's land. It's real estate. And there's other hard assets also. But having a hard asset in your hand that you possess and having a Federal Reserve note, take one out of your pocket. I told you this last week. Take a look at the top of it. It's Federal Reserve note. What's a note? It's a promise to pay. That is not your dollar, folks. That is the promise to pay that you have in your hand from the Federal Reserve. And of course, they've gotten everything just so right since 1913 when that abomination was constructed, fabricated, conjured out of thin air. But that is yet another tale. Remember that I have underneath this show and all the reality of money shows that we're going to be doing, links to some of my previous shows, the history of banking, the history of the Federal Reserve, the history of money. You should listen to those. They give you lots of details going way back, thousands of years. And you know, human nature is human nature. There's greed and there's fear. Oh, there's other things, but those are the 2 main things that fuel the human race, always has. And they aren't going to change. And neither is the outcome when it comes to these various types of money. Today we're going to talk in depth, well, at least in relative depth, about M2 liquidity, the money supply, because liquidity is what drives the ship. It's what creates the bubbles, creates markets, creates inflation, creates too many things, in the case of the United States, dollars, chasing too few goods and services, which is inflation, by the way. So we're going to start there with liquidity, because there's all sorts of overt, covert, nefarious ways that the Federal Reserve and the Treasury, who sometimes work hand in hand and sometimes work at cross purposes, conspire, shall we say, to create financial conditions, money supply conditions, which can favor the economy or disfavor it, favor employment, disfavor it, fuel inflation, attack inflation. All of these concern you and impact you directly. I mean, right in your pocketbook, right on your kitchen table, right in your pantry, right in the fuel you put in your vehicle, you name it. Every day-to-day item in day-to-day life is affected by these macroeconomic gyrations, conjurers, games, if you will. First, though, I'm going to give you, because I think it's really apropos, particularly relative to this show, a quote from Warren Buffett. This would be our quote for the day. Price is what you pay. Value is what you get. Now think about that for just a moment. Price is what you pay, and value is what you get. Value is that thing that you get for whatever you have paid, and in whatever manner you have paid, whether it happens to be Israeli shekels, Argentinian pesos, United States dollars, it doesn't matter. That is what you pay with right now. What you get, the car, the tomato, the rake, the hammer, the whatever you're buying, is the value that you receive. And when you have to pay more to receive the same value, that's inflation. And inflation is caused by, in all respects, if you boil it down to the nubbins, it is created by liquidity. How many dollars or pesos or shekels or yuan, if you're in China, are chasing the same piece of value, the thing you're buying? Okay, think about that for just a moment. Then I'm going to give you a rather humorous ranch story. So first of all, you can see I still got my camo on. I actually came down the hill to do this show for you. So I'm trying to stick with our every couple of days schedule that I got sorely distracted from, waylaid from over the last 3 or 4 weeks. And I had to pick up some supplies, some gas for the generator, et cetera, et cetera. But hunting season is in full swing. And I had a friend, also a partner in the Upper Ranch, and we're going to have some great pictures for you in this show. Some of the headquarters and some of the upper place where we're chasing elk, so far unsuccessfully. The elk have every advantage, folks. Trust me, they have every advantage. And I think you'll enjoy them. But this is a humorous story, okay? And, I'll give you the moral of the story with a smile at the end. But anyway, this friend of mine is great. He was up with his son hunting, and they have a ranch in Colorado. And he also has tags down there. And Colorado has weird seasons. There's like 10 seasons, and they're all like 5 or 6 days, and it's really kind of a mess. Wyoming has one, well, actually, the season for elk goes months and months, but the season for bull elk, at least in our area, goes from October 15th to November 20th. And then your tag is good for a cow, and I won't bore you with all the details. Some of you may not even hunt. Some of you may not like to hunt. Personally, I like to eat. Therefore, I like to hunt. But because the conflict, both seasons started on the 15th, and of course he has a very short season in Colorado, he was undecided about what he was going to do. Initially, he was going to hunt in Colorado on his place down there, which is a great elk ranch, and then hopefully fill his tag and then head up to Wyoming, where there's a lot more time to hunt. But for whatever reason, he changed his mind. He didn't stick to the plan. He arrives late at night, the 14th, right, the night before season opens in Wyoming. I'm up at the Upper Ranch headquarters. Here they come up the road, bumpity, bumpity, bump. The purr and the whine of the turbo diesels of their trucks. He was with his son, kind of echoing off the timber and the canyon as they were coming up the road. And they unpack a whole bunch of stuff, food, you name it. And then we hunted the next day. We saw some elk from afar, nothing close. Beautiful day, and weather was coming in. And that evening, the evening of the 15th, I stumbled on down the mountain, pretty much in the dark, and just beat a torrential downpour that lasted for like 2 hours with thunder and lightning. In all the years I have hunted, in all the places I have been for opening day, many states, different countries, different continents for that matter, I have never, ever, ever seen thunder and lightning on opening day of any season ever. It was just bizarre. And it was not just a little thunder, it was a lot. And not just a little lightning, it was arcing across the sky. I mean, silhouetting the skyline. Anyway, they come back in. And they got there just as the rain started. And they announced that they were going to leave that night. And it's a slimy, muddy, messy road down to the Colorado state line from the Upper Ranch, about 90 miles of mud and clay and nastiness and curves. And I said, well, are you crazy? At least leave in the morning. I mean, you guys should have hunted Colorado first and then come up to Wyoming. Yeah, well, but we're going to, but anyway, off they go. And I get a text from him the next day. Number one, they did run into a nice bull elk down there, harvested that elk, good for them. But their trip down was a trip from hell. First of all, they had their dog, a great dog, mellow. Their dog with them, Goose. and the dog, well, here, they left the ranch. It's a slimy mess. They could barely make any progress whatsoever. It's darker than hell out there. It's the middle of nowhere. And it's pouring rain. So they're slipping and sliding across the road. Well, number one of them took a wrong turn. The other tried to make a sharp turn to get on the right fork of the road, wound up in the ditch, had to dig themselves out of that. Second, the truck got sprayed, my friend's truck got sprayed by a skunk. And the dog, when my friend got out to check on it, the dog got out of the truck and the dog got sprayed by a skunk. Now, I don't know if you have ever smelled a skunk, particularly up close and personal, or if you ever have smelled a skunk on a wet animal that's been sprayed. It is highly unpleasant, and it stinks up everything, and the odor lingers and rubs off, you name it. So now the dog's in the truck with him, sprayed with a skunk. The outside of the truck is sprayed with a skunk. Obviously, it was a dismal drive. And then to top it all off, his son gets a speeding ticket once they hit the pavement, 90 miles or 100 miles south of here, whenever that was. So they got down to where they were going in Colorado at 1:30 in the morning. And why don't we just say, it was the trip from hell. And the moral of this story is, when you have a plan, unless the situation really, really, really warrants it, stick with the plan. It's always the best way to go, because otherwise the unexpected will happen when you deviate. All right. Let's talk about, I want to go over just a few rat-a-tat-tats with you. These are pretty big ones. I'm going to be bringing you a show on what's happening in the gun control field, because all is not wine and roses in North America, Canada, or the United States. And some other really salient stories, some of which tie into this part two of the reality of money, i.e., liquidity. What is liquidity? So in Canada, just over the last several weeks, the left-wing loons up there have passed a law saying that basically every weapon in Canada, I mean down to 22s, is illegal. And Canadians are going to be offered a buyback, a la Australia and New Zealand. Wow. They haven't learned their lesson yet, watching what happened there. And the buyback, this is really insidious. The Canadian government is spending billions to do this, okay, that they don't have. The buyback will buy back 17,000 firearms, and there's an estimated 1.5 million now restricted and forbidden firearms in Canada. Needless to say, the Canadian folks who believe in their equivalent of the Second Amendment, which is not a God-given right as it is in our Constitution, but more or less a privilege bestowed by the Charter. I've brought you that story too. So they have enough money to buy back 17,000 weapons. And they've told everybody, look, if you're first in line, you have a chance of getting paid out. And if you're not, well, then there's no money to buy you out, and we'll just come take it. How's that for a little coercion? Kind of reminds you of Trudy up there when he froze the bank accounts of the truckers, Canada's just a tad out of control. Alberta and Saskatchewan, come on down to the United States. I think you're a much better fit here than there. And there is, in fact, many Canadians thinking about leaving Canada over this and a host of other sociopathic, liberal, just moronic, control-driven factors going on up there. But all is not wine and roses in the United States. Okay, I don't know if you know this, but back in June, there were two cases that the Supreme Court declined to hear. One was the large magazine ban in Rhode Island, and the other was the automatic weapons ban in Maryland. And we're talking about AKs, AR, basically all automatic rifles, just about all, were banned in Maryland. Both those cases made it up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court refused to hear them, which means that the laws stand. That's not good, folks. That's really, really, really not good. And we now have a lawsuit that's been brought in Culpeper County, Virginia, because Culpeper County, in the dead of night, changed the zoning laws. And basically, they changed them to affect all private gun ranges. In fact, down to, if you're a dad, teaching your son to shoot his .22 on your back acreage. And you now have to have 25 acres, special licenses, special permits, lots of money, lots of red tape. And they managed to call these, in this dead of the night change in the zoning laws, any ranges, private ranges, like many of us go to from time to time, are now commercial firearms training centers. Okay. That lawsuit is just starting. It'll be very interesting to see what happens, and you can rest assured it will reach the Supreme Court. In New Jersey, there is actually a pretty good chance that a Republican could get elected governor. And if you have seen the gal that the Democrats are running and her effusively evasive and absolutely black and white lies that she spews in interviews and in debates, there's no wonder why the Republican may win. And that would be a really big deal. And if this Republican wins, he'll probably carry on his coattails 17 seats in the state legislature, which will flip maybe one of the houses red. And New Jersey, now the highest tax state in the United States, even more than California, might just be saved from itself. We shall see. Also on the eastern seaboard, there's a pretty good chance that Winsome Earl Sears, who is terrific, black gal, was lieutenant governor, and I really like her. She could win the gubernatorial seat in Virginia, which would be great because the gal the Democrats have running there is like a photocopy, a carbon copy of the moron they have running in New Jersey. Both of those are going to be on the website on the rightsideradio.com, as will the links to the previous shows relative to the reality of money that we're doing today. And you should send the elections are not far off. I mean, they're like within a week or two. Send these folks $10, $15, $20, $5, whatever you can send. That would be huge to break the blue juggernaut on the East Coast and would really help in the 26 midterm elections, which are pretty damn critical. In fact, we're going to have a new section on the website starting next week, and it'll be called Election 26. We're going to fold all our recommended contributions, all that stuff into there. You can go to one spot on the website, see what's happening in key races, any stories which might affect those key races, and see where to donate, particularly on multiples, 5 to 1, 10 to 1. There's one right now for 27 to 1 that we'll have up for this show. And it'll still be under recommended contributions, that link for this show, next show, Election 26. You betcha. Federal judges. You know, federal judges seem to like to run amok. It's like a kindergarten deal. Particularly those federal judges who, coincidence, were appointed by Obama, and in some cases Clinton, and in one or two cases by Biden, which was really Obama. So federal judges have now restricted the use of the National Guard in Chicago because there's no crime problem in Chicago, folks. Just 40,000 people a year shot, not a problem. 4,000 on a weekend, who cares? And they've also restricted what local police can do to help ICE when ICE gets into problems trying to round up illegal aliens or criminal illegal aliens. I think this is all going to be overturned, but this will just show you the lunacy of the left, right? Ideology over common sense and disruptive principle over the good of the American people. All right, I'll keep you up to date because some of these rulings were just mind-boggling. One of them, by the way, was by a gal, I believe Susan Morris or Susan Wilson, appointed by Obama, in the Northern District of California. Oh, okay, great. Gee, what did you expect on that ruling? All right. Denmark. This gets right into the reality of money show today. Denmark has nationalized the country's largest chip manufacturer, which just so happens to be owned by a Chinese company. This is kind of like Steal Your Assets 2.0. The first 1.0 was stealing 300 billion of Russian US dollar reserves, which began this precipitous drop in the value of the dollar. Remember, price is what you pay, value is what you get. In 2022, and I think it was done intentionally, particularly since that's Obama's third term, and his head economic advisor said in 2014 and in 2024, I brought it to you, okay, it's time for King Dollar to be dethroned. Well, gee, what better way to dethrone it than to wreck the world's trust in it, right? If you have dollars, or I guess now you have Danish guilders, we'll just take it, And of course, you won't get any investment in your countries because nobody will trust that they can keep their asset, but small price to pay, right? Small price to pay to keep the elites in power. This was thought to have been done kind of as a weak punchback at the Chinese last Friday, the 10th of October, dropping an atomic bomb in terms of economic things and monetary things, basically limiting the export of all rare earths, period, from China. And they control 90% of the refining capacity for rare earths. And rare earths do all sorts of things, including all the magnets that are needed for AI, this expansion of data centers that you keep reading about that's going to be the foundation of the American manufacturing renaissance, and even down to car parts, folks. You have a car, you need it repaired, well, you may not be getting a part to get it repaired. This is a really, really, really big deal. A really big deal. And somehow I don't think that nationalizing the Chinese chip factory in Denmark is going to do much but other than to set the Chinese jaw, so to speak. And make no mistake, the Western world, including the United States, is 2 to 5 years away from being able to really even come close to manufacturing its own rare earth, refining its own rare earth materials at a level that will even come close to sustaining the growth in demand for those materials or even their current use. This is a huge deal, right? As I told you last week, and I've told you before, all wars are economic. And trust me, we are in an economic war. The global South and the BRICS nations against the West. And the West, unfortunately, other than just a few countries in Europe and the United States, are run by elitist morons, which is why we're in the position that we are. Okay. Let's talk about liquidity. Okay. Let's get into our Money is Reality Part 2. So liquidity is the amount of money, not value, the amount of money in the system. Money, loosely defined in this case as fiat currency, okay? The note, the promise to pay you $1, right? The Federal Reserve note. And I'm talking right now about the United States, but this can apply to any Western economy. There was an economist by the name of Keynes, and Keynes is really the economist that corrupted a tangible-based and backed monetary system. And he had all sorts of weird deals, which are now coming to play in the form of impending collapse and destruction of all fiat currencies around the world. And money supply is how liquidity is measured. And there's all sorts of different factors in money supply and different nomenclatures, M2, M6. I'm not going to go into those details with you. You can look those up. It's really easy. You can go to the Federal Reserve website and look them up. You can just Google it and look it up. But the bottom line is the money supply, despite supposed tightening by the Federal Reserve, has been mostly growing the last 4 or 5 years, and it got its kick in the butt to really get on the warpath during the COVID deal when Mr. Biden, did the Inflation Reduction Act. Wow. You talk about psyops. Okay. So money supply, folks, is based on a currency. The currency is the fiat paper of a country. And the more dollars, in the case of the United States, you have floating around, the higher the money supply, the greater the liquidity. And the more money there is to do all sorts of things, including malinvestment, which is where you waste money that will give you no return, no benefit. For instance, all the social programs, all the things that Doge uncovered, USAID, I can go on down the list. It's trillions of dollars. But currency okay, is measured against all other currencies relative to its strength. Usually, the greater the money supply, the lower the relative value of each unit of currency that constitutes that money supply. So if you have a huge money supply, the dollar is going to be down relative to other countries' currencies and vice versa. The higher the interest rate, generally speaking, the higher the currency's value relative to all other currencies, because you can get a better return and more people will buy dollars. And we're about to get into how they buy dollars here in just a moment. And the less people will buy of other currencies which don't pay or pay a lesser interest rate. So there's lots of factors that go into this, but we're focusing on liquidity right now. And in liquidity is limited when you have a tangible backing for a currency. If you back your currency, as obviously China is aiming to do shortly and already partially doing, and Russia and the BRICS countries, with precious metals such as gold, you don't have the latitude to expand that currency. You can't go out and print yuan in the case of China, or dollars in the case of the United States, or shekels in the case of Israel, or pesos in the case of Argentina, if all those currencies are backed to a certain percentage by a tangible asset. The central banks of the world are obviously choosing gold. They've been buying it hands over fist for the last 4 years. And that limits how much new money you can create, which strengthens the money that is already in circulation, your money supply, right? The less dollars you have, the more each is worth. The more dollars you have, the less each is worth. The currency that you're using to buy a value, to use Warren Buffett's terminology. And if you have lots of dollars sloshing around, you need more currency to buy the same value, i.e., inflation. It's really that simple. So, the war that's going on around the globe right now, between countries, between regions, between pockets of status quo power, between the BRICS nations and the Western nations, and between the global South along with the BRICS nations and the rest of the world, is all economic. And it's all centered around resources, starting, by the way, with gold and rare earths and silver and manganese and magnesium and nickel and copper and oil, and I can go on down the list. He who has the most land has the most access to resources. And he who has the best currency has the best ability to exploit those resources on the land that they control. Do you see why everybody is head-to-head right now over land? Everybody is head-to-head over energy. Everybody is obviously head-to-head over currencies versus currencies, and over fiat versus tangible-backed monies. This is a huge economic war, which can spill out in lots of other areas, including kinetic. And even the kinetic conflicts that we've been in revolve around land, resources, and power. It's all tied in. Nothing operates independently of anything else. The way a country creates, and I'm going to use the United States as an example, the way a country creates increases or decreases in liquidity or money supply are many and varied. Some covert, they try and hide it, and some in your face. They don't try and hide it. It's kind of the shiny object to distract you from what they're really doing. Money supply can be controlled in the case of the United States and in most countries with fiat currencies, which is basically all countries of the planet, by the central bank, in our case, the Federal Reserve. And how do they do that? Well, to finance the operations of the government and the debt of the government and the interest payments on the debt of the government, you know, that 37 trillion that our vaunted leaders, particularly Obama, I think he and Biden are responsible for 21 trillion of the 37 trillion or more. That debt is a drag, and that debt interest has to be paid. Well, one of the ways interest gets paid is for the Fed literally to hit a digital button, create money, and pay the interest. And it's really a loan to the Treasury because the Treasury is the fiscal arm. Okay, the Fed is the monetary control arm. They're two separate animals, supposedly. The Treasury issues United States Treasuries, T-bills, T-notes, mostly of shorter duration, 5 years or less, down to a month, in fact. And they also issue longer-term bonds, 10-year and 30-year bonds. The 10-year bond, by the way, is what drives mortgage rates. So you might want to pay attention to what that does. And the 30-year bond is what kind of drives long-term financings for business. The shorter-term rates is what drives like lines of credit, short-term financing for business. All these things are critical. When the Fed wants to put money into the system, in other words, increase liquidity or the M supply, whether it's M2, M6, or whatever, they buy United States Treasuries. That's right. They're in there buying our own debt. The Federal Reserve of the United States is buying the debt of the United States. It's great. And the way they do that is to hit that digital button and do digital printing of money, which transfers on the internet. Isn't that great? They can just create trillions of dollars with a flick of a button. It's terrific. You should feel very safe with those dollars in your pocket, those promises to pay, folks. If they want to tighten money, and by the way, easing money is called quantitative easing. You've heard the term. But that's what's happening with quantitative easing. That's when the Fed is stepping into the Treasury market and injecting capital by buying treasuries or paying interest on treasuries, albeit through a loan to the Treasury and all sorts of other mechanics. But that's the net result. Quantitative tightening is just the opposite. That's when they are not buying treasuries. That's when they are letting treasuries which are already on their books, in other words, their assets, expire. Just poof, go off into thin air as they reach their maturity date. Remember that treasuries, like all bonds, go up in value, that is what you can sell your bond for, when interest rates go down. Because if you have a bond that's paying, I'm just going to round numbers, 5%, and interest rates go down to 3%, well, your bond is worth, I'm rounding numbers again, 40% more, because you can sell the bond, and instead of Joe, who bought your bond, getting 3% by buying it in the market, he's getting 5% buying it from you. So rates, that is the interest rates, move inversely to yields. The higher the rate, the lower the face value of the bond, or the lower the nominal value of the bond, I should say. And the lower the rate, the higher the value of existing bonds. Keep all this in mind as we go through this Money is Reality series, and feel free to do your own research. And as always, I have all sorts of articles and videos on the website, on therightsideradio.com. Check these out. They will give you the story behind the story, the rest of the story, as Paul Harvey would say, and the details, which I don't have time to go into. I'm trying to paint you the broad brush picture. If you can understand that, you are ahead of 99% of the humans on planet Earth, which puts you way ahead in a very important aspect of economics, which affects your day-to-day living and your future security and probably your future freedoms. There's other ways that the Fed or the Treasury can loosen monetary reins. In other words, get more capital into the system or more capital available to the system. Remember when Signature Bank and all those banks, I think it was First Republic, went under here 2 years ago? And the Federal Reserve enacted some emergency measures. It allowed banks in the Federal Reserve System, which is basically all banks, to take their United States treasuries that they had on their books as assets, which, because interest rates had gone up, thanks to the Fed, had gone down in value, and instead of marking them to market, and literally all these banks becoming insolvent overnight, they allowed those banks for a 1 year, which has been extended, period, to sell those bonds at face value, not their discounted value because of higher interest rates. Remember, rates, bonds, to the Federal Reserve. So they got cash. The Federal Reserve holds the bonds. They didn't have to mark them to market, and we didn't have a banking system that cratered overnight. And that injected money into the system. Additionally, the Fed and the Treasury have relaxed regulations on banks. So over the past year, we have a fractional reserve banking system. In other words, if the bank has $10 in reserves, it can loan out $100. It needs 10% fractional reserve. And remember from last week, when you create debt, you create money. We are a debt-based, unfortunately for us, a debt-based system. That is one of the hallmarks of a fiat currency. So when a bank makes you a loan for a car for $20,000, they just increase the money supply of the country by $20,000. Well, if the Fed and the Treasury relax regulations and the banks don't have to keep a 10% reserve, in other words, they can only loan out 90 cents on their 10% capital, and they lower it to 5% or 0%, you have now created 10% more lending capacity, in other words, ability to create money, because debt is the creation of money, in the system, which increases M2 and liquidity, which gets more dollars sloshing around in the system, getting involved in malinvestment, creating bubbles in the stock market and elsewhere. And people, people go on and party hardy until the party's over. And the party is always over, folks. At some point, every party ends. The guests go home. The hall is quiet with just the rubbish of the festive activities of the night before. And that's about where we're at in this whole cockamamie scheme. That is, shall we say, on wobbly legs, if not its last legs, which is why I'm bringing you this series now. You may have noticed that gold you've heard, some of you may be involved in gold, some of you may be involved in silver or other metals or commodities, whatever. But you've heard that gold has skyrocketed up to almost $4,400 an ounce, down a little bit, I think, today. Silver up to $54 an ounce, give or take. These are huge moves for these metals. And these metals are trying to tell you something, folks. They're trying to tell you something's really wrong. They're also trying to tell you that the price is higher for the same value. Thank you, Warren Buffett. Which means if the price is higher, you need more units of currency, more of those $1 Federal Reserve notes in your pocket to get the same thing done that you could have gotten done for less Federal Reserve notes yesterday and the day before and last year. In fact, the dollar has devalued almost 90% over the last decade. 90%. And you want to believe them that inflation is 2.8%? Be my guest. Be my guest. If you want to believe your lion eyes when you go to the grocery store, well, That's up to you. So you see all these ways to create money, fiat money, money backed by nothing, is the way they get liquidity up. And the higher the liquidity, the more vroom, 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 supposedly, the economy. And the more dangerous the pricing of assets and markets, because it's all based on the full faith and credit of the United States or Japan or whatever country you happen to be in. And the full faith and credit is suspect, shall we say. Not just, by the way, in the Western world, but around the world. However, the rest of the world is moving to a system, and I've brought you these stories, a system where their currencies are at least partially backed by tangible assets, mostly gold, to some extent, much lesser silver. We're going to talk more about gold and silver and base metals and all that kind of stuff within this series, okay? I will tell you that if you don't have a little, you should get some. That is real money. Okay, it's one of the reasons the BRICS and the Global South are moving toward a gold-backed currency, because it is real money that people trust. They don't have to trust the government. There's that yellow rock that backs that piece of paper or that digital entry. And you can trade the piece of paper or the digital entry for the yellow rock or a portion thereof, or several yellow rocks, depending upon what the transaction is. So you want to think about these types of things, okay? But liquidity is what drives inflation. And inflation is what decreases the value of, in our case, the dollar. And the decrease in the dollar, what you pay, will affect the value that you get. It's that simple. It really is that simple. So we'll talk more about this here in the coming weeks. Next week, we're going to look at the next kind of phase of our Reality of Money series, which is the banking system and the Federal Reserve System, how they interact, what it means to you in your checking accounts. Like, did you know that you don't own the money in your checking accounts? I'm not making that up. The bank owns it, folks. You simply have the bank's IOU. And they can do all sorts of things due to several laws that were passed, including under our friend Barack Obama in 2010. You will learn about bail-ins, not bailouts, bail-ins. That's when you, the depositor, bail out the bank, not the government bail out the bank. Just as a precursor to the next show, which will be in a few days, I'll give you two nuggets here, if you will. There's $18 trillion, give or take, in bank deposits in commercial banks in the United States. Commercial banks, credit unions, you name it. 18 trillion in deposits. The FDIC, whom you think insures your deposit to $250,000, they are mandated under the law to cover that with a 1.35% ratio. 1.35%, folks. 1.35%, let me see what the numbers are here. 1.35% is about $230 billion against $18 trillion. However, they're not at 1.35%. They have to get there under law by September of 2028. They are now lower than that. They were at 1.22% in June of 2024, and I think they're at 1.28% right now, which, by the way, is under $200 billion, backing $18 trillion in deposits. And you want to rely on the FDIC to get you back your $250,000? Good luck with that, folks. Good luck with that. I'm going to give you one other interesting little thing which will tie in with the show today. If you don't think that liquidity and money supply drive bubbles and asset values. In other words, the more there is of the dollar, the less each dollar is worth, the more dollars it takes to buy X, the stock, the gold, the car, the hay. It doesn't matter what it is, the widget. Let me give you some really interesting statistics. In October of 2000, the year 2000, that's 25 years ago this month, money supply was equal to the stock market. In other words, the stock market had a value and money supply as a ratio were more or less 1-to-1. Since that time, money supply has increased 4.6 times. The stock market, folks, has gone up 4.5 times. That is not just a coincidence. Let's just take the S&P. Money supply went up 4.6 times, and the S&P all by itself, never mind the broader stock markets, went up 4.5 times. In other words, the supposed value of stocks has gone up almost identically over 25 years to the increase in the amount of dollars in the economy, and therefore the amount of dollars chasing stocks, which increases prices, right? Price, value. Thank you, Warren Buffett. Price and value. Gold, in the meantime, has gone up 15x, folks, since 2000, October of 2000, because gold carries no counterparty risk. It's not paper. It's real. It's tangible, a la the theory I was trying to get across here in the last show. And I'm not telling you to be a gold bug and a silver bug and whatever. I'm just asking you to think about what is money and what is currency and what is real money. What is the price you pay for the value that you get, a la Warren Buffett? And where are we at now in the cycle, and where might we be in the short term, the intermediate term, and the long term? And lastly, what can you do to protect not your price, but your value, the value of your life, the value of your property, the value of your assets, and yes, the value of your money? All right, lots of things to think about. Hopefully my generalist approach has helped you kind of understand, at least in the big picture, how all these machinations work in terms of liquidity and what liquidity means in the market and what liquidity means to a currency, dollar, yen, shekel, peso, doesn't matter, yuan, because it's all the same. And it's been the same since time immemorial, going back 5,000 years. In the history of money, I tell you about the Roman Empire and its currency. You should listen to that on the rightsideradio.com, underneath the audio bar for this show, in fact. I'll be back at you with the next tangent, which is banking and the Federal Reserve and how it all kind of ties in here in the United States and across the globe, because these guys are all in cahoots, folks. None of this happens in a vacuum. Trust me, none of it. And some of it is downright scary. And the end results, or the potential end results, are downright petrifying. So that's where we're at. And I am now going back up to the upper ranch. You enjoy the ranch picks, and I'll tell you how we did. I'll tell you if there was any more, should we say, not following the game plan up there. I'm sure there will be. This is Reed Lance Rosenthal on the Right Side Radio and the Cowboys Take. And I'll talk to you in a few days. You keep the wind at your back.